The Carolina Panthers hold the number 1 overall pick after trading up with the Chicago Bears. They had their pre-draft press conference earlier this week. A couple of interesting things have come out of this. General Manager Scott Fitterer, for one, you're right. He did say the Panthers have clarity. And this isn't something the Panthers said, but conveniently, very conveniently, in my opinion, Bryce Young canceled his remaining draft visits, having visited Carolina and Houston. So maybe he doesn't know where he's going, but it seems like he's pretty confident he's going to be one of the first 2 picks in this draft. That's my read on the situation.
Listen, Bryce Young, don't overthink him. That's the bottom line. I know we've got size concerns and weight concerns and all that other stuff. Scott Fitterer, according to his press conference, didn't have any of these concerns. You know, he kept comparing him to Russell Wilson's size and how Russell Wilson was able to put on weight and all this other stuff. Once he got into the league and had the benefit of an off-season program and off-season programs with NFL strength staffs. But Bryce Young is the best quarterback in this draft, period, full stop. And if he is the best quarterback in this draft and Carolina is one of the most quarterback needy teams, guess what you should do? You should take Bryce Young at the top.
If the question is which quarterback are they going to take, I thought if we're looking for newsworthy items to come out of a pre-draft press conference, this takes the cake for me, is that Scott Fitterer mentioned Russell Wilson. And some very, very necessary context here is that Scott Fitterer's background is with the Seattle Seahawks. He was a scout there for a decade. He was their director of college scouting during the time frame that Russell Wilson was drafted, by the way.
Yes.
So Scott Fitterer spent a lot of time looking at Russell Wilson before the Seahawks ultimately pulled the trigger. Now, I can hear the criticism and say, yeah, but Russell Wilson was a 3rd round pick. Bryce Young would be the 1st overall pick. Newsflash, if you could do it all over again, you would take Russell Wilson at the top of that draft. Like, you probably wouldn't think that hard about it. Even in a draft that included Andrew Luck, what you've gotten out of Russell Wilson over the last decade is, even if Luck was a better pure prospect, what you've gotten over Russell Wilson is inarguably better. So I don't really think that means anything. And if a guy that helped draft Russell Wilson sees similar qualities in Bryce Young, again, I'm just not sure if I'm overthinking this. And I feel 99% confident that Bryce Young is going to wind up being Carolina's pick. Obviously, if we both think Bryce Young is going to be a Carolina Panther, that's where this starts to get fascinating, because look, our colleagues at the 4-letter network, Adam Schefter in particular, are doing a lot of suggesting that Houston might not be interested in using this pick on a quarterback. And when I look at it, I say, again, I think you've got to look at where you are on a timeline. Like, how far are you from truly being able to compete for a Super Bowl? And in the AFC, my God, where
you've got a long way to go.
Patrick Mahomes is there, Joe Burrow's there, Aaron Rodgers might be there before it's all said and done. The Buffalo Bills are still hanging out. So with keeping all of that in mind, it's hard to take the Texans seriously as a contender anytime in the next, I would say, at least 2 years, unless they just do a magnificent job. So if that's the case, maybe you use this draft, and they've got a lot of capital. They pick all over the top 100. They pick 2nd. They pick 12th. They pick at the top of the 2nd and 3rd rounds. Maybe you say, we're going to load up our roster. We can get a Will Anderson or a Jalen Carter. We can find receivers for our future quarterback. And then guess what? You traded Deshaun Watson and still hold multiple 1st-round picks in next year's draft. With that type of capital, you can try to climb to the top of the draft next year and go after Caleb Williams or Drake May or anybody else that suits your fancy. So I understand how silly it sounds to trade away from a quarterback, but if you don't think he's the guy, there's no need to force it when you're in this situation, in my opinion.
I completely agree, because I think that if you are maybe perhaps in love with Bryce Young, listen, that number 1 pick is not for sale anymore. Carolina Panthers moved up there. That's solidified. They're making their pick there. There's no amount of capital you can give them at this point that's going to get them to move out of that. And if you're maybe only in love with Bryce Young, And it's hard to say, oh, well, let's just wait till next year. That's a dangerous game to play in this league. However, for all the reasons you just outlined, in that the Texans have a bunch of capital this year, they have a bunch of capital next year, even if they're not picking in the top 5 next year, they are going to have enough capital to move up to get whoever they want. And I would venture to say, I'm going to go out on a limb here, that if you don't take a quarterback this draft and you focus on the rest of your roster, you're still not going to be really that competitive next year. You don't have a guy under center throwing the ball and delegating. So perhaps you're probably still going to be picking in the top 5. And again, you can take Will Anderson at 2, or you can trade out of that spot too, because I think that there are more than just the Carolina Panthers and the Houston Texans who need quarterbacks.
We're on to the Cardinals, the burning question surrounding them. I mean, the Cardinals are a fascinating team if quarterbacks go 1-2 in the draft, because now they're open for business. If that's not the case, like say something happens ahead of them, what do you do? And really, for me, I guess the question is, how likely is it that the Cardinals even make this pick? Because for me, even knowing that Will Anderson and Jalen Carter are great players, with the amount of stuff that the Cardinals need, and consider the fact their best receiver, DeAndre Hopkins, and their fantastic safety, Budda Baker, both want out of town. Budda Baker requesting a trade as recently as this week. I mean, we know DeAndre Hopkins has been on the market since the season ended. But if the closest 2 things besides your quarterback, Kyler Murray, your closest 2 things to cornerstone players want to be traded, isn't this the team that needs as much draft capital as possible?
Absolutely. And I think I'm going to go so far as to say it would be irresponsible for them to make this pick, given all of the holes they have. Not to mention, you mentioned the guys that are on the trading block. What about JJ Watt that just retired? This is a pass rush that needs a severe livening up. It needs a severe makeover. And not to mention, there's going to be a wide receiver need for the Cardinals. There's needs all over this roster. And they have a new regime coming in. This is a chance to start rebuilding and really, send this into maybe shorten the time period that's going to take to rebuild. And in order to do that, you have to trade out of the 3rd spot. And I do think that in this scenario where quarterbacks go 1-2, again, I just talked about it being the big 3 at this point. If you want a chance at one of the big 3, you're going to have to move up to that spot. And I'm looking at the Colts at number 4, who are going to be like, well, crap, we're not going to be able to stay here at 4 and get a quarterback. So they're going to move up the 1 spot into number 3. And still, Arizona could come away with some extra draft capital both this year and next for making a 1-spot move.
Let go of the idea that Will Levis is a top 5 prospect. That kind of brings us through the quarterback frenzy. And then it puts you in a very interesting spot to round out the top 5. Seattle, they've been very smitten with the quarterback prospects this offseason, but they did just sign Geno Smith. But that deal kind of gives them a quick out if they want it. Like, there's any number of ways they can go here. But I just wonder, when you look at how this team is constructed and you look at how much they surprised people, and they have another 1st-round pick to use up at number 20 later in the 1st round, this just feels like a chance for Seattle to benefit from the quarterback frenzy. And that is why, to quote Peter King earlier this week, like, they are the cliche answer for the eventual landing spot for Jalen Carter, the widely thought to be best prospect in this draft, who for multiple reasons is likely could fall into this spot or worse.
Yeah, he's such an interesting dude because the talent is there. The talent is insane. In fact, I've heard from multiple scouts and coaches just about how many plays this guy can make, how well that can translate into the league. He's going to be able to be wreaking havoc just like he did on the field at Georgia in the NFL. No one is worried about anybody's talent catching up with him or anything like that. There are concerns, though. There are some legitimate concerns with him, not only with the legal issues he's had off the field, but in his work ethic, how good of a teammate he is, how toxic he might be to a team culture. Therefore, he would need to go to a place that is willing and able to withstand someone coming in, they have a good culture in place, they have good coaches that will work with Jalen in order to have him be in the best case scenario and get the most you absolutely can out of him. Now, does Seattle take that risk? Like we mentioned before, they have 2 first-round picks. So they kind of have, I feel like, a little bit more flexibility. They have a little bit more luxury because of the fact that they can pick twice in the first round. But how risky do we think Seattle is, especially when you consider kind of recent history in whiffing on perhaps prospects or having to let them go? I think you know who I'm talking about at this point. So how
Malik
risky do we think that Seattle's
to mind,
right? And so how risky do you think Seattle is going to be? And will they be the one to take a chance on Jalen? Because to be clear, talent aside, it is taking a chance on him because of the teammate that he is rumored and from what I've heard is in the locker room.
Here's a hot take for you.
Ooh.
Seattle, I mean, justifiably, look, Seattle built an annual contender off the back of the draft. You know, Russell Wilson, like we just talked about, Earl Thomas, Cam Chancellor, Richard Sherman, all those great, Wagner, they all came through the draft. Then they went through a little bit of a lull where John Schneider and Pete Carroll were not so hot. But guess what, baby? They got their mojo back last year. Whether you want to talk about Charles Cross and Abraham Lucas, whether you want to talk about Kenneth Walker, the running back who was in contention for offensive rookie of the year. How about Tariq Woolen? The report on Tariq Woolen coming out of Texas San Antonio last year was that he was a freaky athlete, but way too raw to have high expectations for. And Seattle turned him into a 6-pick defensive rookie of the year candidate as right from the get-go. So Seattle's got their mojo back. And with that in the back of their mind, I don't know what's going to happen, but like, I don't think John Schneider and Pete Carroll should be afraid of drafting a quote unquote culture risk. Like if I'm them, I'm like, yeah, our culture is awesome. And whatever doubt we had about it, we just got it back by drafting all these badasses in 2022. Here in the top 5, it's crazy to think we're not that far removed from the Chicago Bears trading up to draft Mitchell Trubisky, trading up from 3 to 2.
One spot.
So it isn't insane to think that the Colts could go up even 1 or 2 spots to make sure they get the guy. And as we teased at the top of this, Jim Irsay is doing his damnedest to make sure we think that's what he wants. The Colts owner, he's been, I mean, you know, I covered the Cowboys for a decade. Jim Irsay has become what people think Jerry Jones is, whether it's, you know, holding impromptu press conferences about how pissed off he is in front of his own plane, hiring his former player and friend to coach the team, mentioning Bryce Young as an option all the way back in January. And now on Sunday, he's tweeting out photos of the big 4 quarterbacks. And
there's a distinction between Jerry Jones and Jim Irsay is that Jim Irsay will take to social media, whereas he has surpassed Jerry Jones as far as
Jerry.
I'm concerned.
Jerry's got a flip phone. Let's be real. Like, I mean, yeah,
Jim Irsay probably should have a flip phone. If we're
I mean, it's incredible, man. And like Jim Irsay can play it coy all he wants by saying like, oh, maybe we won't do any of this. I'm like, no, dude. You're drafting a quarterback.
No, you're doing something.
You are sick of how bad your team has been since Andrew Luck retired, and you want a guy for the future. I don't know who it is. I don't think it'll be Bryce Young, but if you have a chance at CJ Stroud or Anthony Richardson, I'll throw Will Levis in there because the Colts have met with him and worked him out, but I really think it's the other 2. I think it would be CJ Stroud and Anthony Richardson. It's not crazy to think that they would trade up to do
go
that.
Up. We're taking for granted that, you know, the Carolina Panthers are the most quarterback needy team, clearly, because they gave up as much as they did just to have the choice of what quarterback they wanted. So right behind them, have you I struggle to think of a comp for an organization that has reeled as hard as the Colts have after Andrew Luck surprisingly retired retired. They are still trying to figure that out. And we are how many years removed from Andrew Luck? I can't think of another time in in the NFL that an organization has repeatedly and over again struggled to figure out how to deal with a quarterback retiring or a player retiring and not been able to fill that hole. So yeah, I think you've got a great point in that Jim Irsay is like, enough is enough. We're going to get our guy, and we're going to get our guy this year. And in order to do that, I think that the Colts are going to have to move up at least one spot if they don't move up to that 2 spot with the Texans.
And we both agree they're not about to hand bigger guarantees than what Jalen Hurts just got to Lamar Jackson, right? Like, I just don't, I don't see that happening.
I don't either. I don't think that that's Chris Ballard's style, though. Trading up in the first round is also not Chris Ballard's style. He's not done so in the last 6 years.
With all due respect to Chris Ballard, he's drafted some great players and he's well respected in the NFL. I don't buy that this is Chris Ballard's call. Like, nothing about
1,000% right.
Nothing about what's happening in Indianapolis over the last year and a half makes me think Chris Ballard has the final say over what's going on there. So that's, I mean,
that's a whole other conversation too. It's just how much ownership has their clause in what decisions teams make from a football side.
We talked about it
from a football
side. We talked about it briefly last week. Like, when quarterbacks get involved, ownership is there. Like, ownership's not letting that decision get made without heavy input. And then when you think about how disappointing things have been in Indy for the last 2 or 3 years, I mean, I'm not defending Jim Irsay, because just take a chill pill, man. But at the same time, like, I get why that would be frustrating. I get it.